Hi, so today I wanted to share a game that I played recently, and also some sort of brief thoughts about, in general, how to review tournament games that you play, and sort of how to extract lessons from them and how to put those into practice in future games. So, in my most recent tournament, in 5 games, I managed to avoid losing all of them except for one. But the one game I did lose was I basically lost without a fight. And those are sort of important games to try to learn from, because ideally you would like to put up a fight in every game you play. So in this game, I had the black pieces, so I will rotate the board if I can remember how to do that. So the game went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, d6. And the game sort of proceeded along standard paths for the first, number of moves. Bishop b3, which is sort of an important move to play at some stage, because eventually black is going to be threatening to play knight a5 and trying to trap the bishop. White could also castle here, because knight a5 is not really a threat yet, because first of all, maybe bishop takes f7 check and b4, but worst case you can escape with the bishop like this. But white in this game decided he didn't want to castle because he was going for a different sort of strategy in this opening where white delays castling. So bishop b3 first, I played a6, which is again standard plan for black. The bishop goes back to a7, white went knight bd2, bishop a7, h3, castles. And here castling by white would transpose into sort of standard paths of the Italian. Instead he played knight f1, which is also a reasonably well-known move, and it's quite a clever idea. The idea is white wants to first put his knight to g3, and then if he's going to castle, he can castle afterwards. And rather than playing castles, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, white can instead play first knight f1, knight g3, and then castle, and then argue that he can maybe just dispense with rook e1 entirely. And also there's some instances where white just doesn't castle at all in order to sort of accentuate his kingside attack. And some instances white even castles queenside. But the problem is white sort of very temporarily blocks himself from castling. So now is a good moment to play d5. Up to this point, both sides were playing rather quickly. White went knight g3, white played queen e2. This is kind of the point of this line. Because white's not in a position to castle at the moment, e takes d5 is particularly poorly timed. White doesn't always want to play e takes d5 in these Italian structures, normally only if he can very quickly put pressure on e5. And with castling and rook e1 not presently on the table, it's not such a good idea. And of course, knight g3, black would just swap on e4 and trade queens most likely, and is probably going to be quite happy to do so, and I don't think white would be terribly happy to allow that. So queen e2. And around this point, I started spending more time than one would ordinarily spend in such a position, because there's nothing particularly special about this position. You can still just sort of make normal moves. Bishop e6, d takes e4, d4, rook e8, h6 are all sort of moves. But what's going on here, this line that white's playing here is a line that I used to play myself about probably 3 years ago, and I stopped playing it, and for some reason I decided I was going to spend an inordinate amount of time. I think by like move 12 I had used up about half an hour of my allotted hour and a half, which seems a bit ridiculous in hindsight, but I remember I stopped playing this line, and I was trying to remember why I stopped playing it, and even like looking at the game at home and looking at this variation at home, I still haven't really been able to reproduce any sort of reason why this line would be bad for white. So this sort of first lesson there is, this sort of reason I think is faulty. I stopped playing this line a while ago, therefore I have to remember the reason I decided it was bad. Well, no, people change lines for all sorts of different reasons. it's not worth spending that much time, even if you do manage to find, like, okay, a clear equalizing variation, or even a path that at least has some slight advantage for black. Using that much time up in the early stages of the game is rarely particularly advisable, because half an hour in 90 plus 30, that's a third of your time, and that ended up becoming particularly relevant later on in the game, when I had quite a bad position, which I was trying to hold together, basically playing on the increment, because I'd used up all my time, well, not just in the opening, but also on some other things later, mostly due to my own stupidity. And the position was bad regardless, but, like, you know, you can at least make an attempt to defend it if you have time on your clock. Anyways, going back to the actual chess of this, I spent a lot of time worrying about various things. The obvious move is bishop e6, which I did eventually end up playing, but I was very paranoid about this pin with bishop g5. Probably not all that justifiably. I mean, it's a decent move, but okay, first of all, you take on e4. White will take back. You take on b3. White will take back. You go queen d6, which essentially just immediately unpins. White still has some chances probably here after a move like knight g3, but essentially, while the queen goes to e6, the knight can come from e8 to d6. You can chase this bishop away with f6. And with the bishop on b3 exchanged off the board, White's attacking potential is, I think, reduced considerably. Although the game around this point should probably still be about even. But yeah, I spent a lot of time sort of weighing the pros and cons of whether I should go bishop e6 or whether I should play h6 first, whether I was sufficiently worried about bishop g5 to spend a move on h6. And if I were to play h6, there's this drawback that in addition to knight g3, White might play g4, which is, well, a famous idea in a lot of these positions. You see it, I think, more often in reverse, where in these structures, White castles first, Black delays castling, White goes h3, Black goes h6, and Black plays g5 at some stage. But, like, for example, it wasn't in Italian, but this famous game, Aroni and Kramnik from the Candidates 2018 in the Berlin with d3, where this theme happened in reverse. I'm not sure how dangerous it is here, actually. I haven't looked at this in much detail. Again, Black can maybe exchange on e4 and then play. Well, bishop e6 is probably possible. Knight h7 is a sort of thematic defense. You can also try knight d7. People have tried queen e7 and queen d6 as well. But in general, I think this sort of idea looks kind of dangerous. And that's what I ended up concluding in the game. So I ended up going for bishop e6 instead. And I felt a little bit silly because I was spending all this time wondering whether I should allow this bishop g5 option or whether I'd rather allow this g4 option in the h6 branch. And very, very quickly, my opponent played knight g3. And then I felt, kind of silly spending all this time deliberating between... I don't know if I'd already spent that much time. Probably, I don't know, about 10-15 minutes by this point. And probably, I mean, I don't remember what he said after the game specifically, but I think he might have just been intending to play knight g3 after either move. So, yeah. That's something probably not terribly worth spending all this time on. And, well, okay, after knight g3, well, by this point I was sort of out of book. Because even when I played this line from the white side, I don't think I really knew any specific variations. I was just sort of on my own. But I've played, positions of this variety from both colors before, although I don't think I've ever had this exact position in a serious game. Or maybe in any game, even. But anyways, the sort of theoretical antidote for black here is to play d takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes b3, a takes b3. And, well, here there's a fairly interesting plan that I learned going through the database after the game, is to play knight e8, which is a theme sort of similar to one you see sometimes in the Samish Nimzo Indian. Black hops the knight back to e8 to sort of step away from this bishop g5 pin. The knight's also coming around to this rather nice square on d6, and the queen often comes either via e7 or d7 to the e6 square. which is also a reasonably nice square. And black's pieces are fairly harmonious, and white's got some menacing looking pieces on the king side, but it shouldn't really be mate. And one important point is that the knight on d6, when it comes to d6, challenges for the f5 square, meaning that white can't land a knight there that easily. And if the bishop comes to g5, or if a piece comes to g5, black can probably kick it away with f6. And again, it helps considerably that this bishop on b3 has disappeared from the board. Anyways, I'm not sure how aware I was of this knight e8, knight d6 plan, but I definitely knew that it was a standard idea to trade pawns on e4, trade bishops on b3, and to bring the queen to e6 in some capacity. But I played queen d7, sort of, I guess, keeping this idea in mind of d4, bishop e3, and queen e6. But first of all, it's better to do it straight away. Second of all, this move order isn't particularly accurate, because white can play knight g5, which he didn't in the game. I'm not sure how strong. It's not winning or anything. White will take the bishop on e6 probably. Black will play f takes e6. White will have the two bishops. Black will have some counterplay along the half-open f file. It probably gives white a slight advantage, but this is an option that's available to white after this queen d7 move. That it's an extra option that probably shouldn't be given to him. And probably, if black doesn't want to take on e4 straight away, and doesn't want to play d4 or whatever, you should start with h6. But for some reason, I was kind of worried about playing h6 in general, just because it can operate as a hook for white's attack sometimes if he manages to land a knight on f5. Like if he plays knight h4, knight f5, the queen comes to f3 or something, and then suddenly sacks on h6 start looking very real. But I think in general, I wasn't worried about this knight g5 idea, and already at this point I was sort of ambitious, and I wanted to try to dispense with h6 entirely. Like I wanted to play rook a d8, take, and even play a move like queen d3, potentially. And, well, I'd played a previous game sort of in a similar line, where I played sort of all of these standard moves. White had castled kingside, I played queen d7, and at some point I sacrificed my bishop on h3. So I was kind of hoping, if white did eventually castle short, to get some sort of option analogous to that game where, well, in that game, white played knight h4, and that made the sacrifice on h3 work. So I guess kind of influenced by that game, and also, yeah. Anyways, I had the idea that if bishop g5, which looks like a natural move, well, it is a natural move, I was going to play de, and knight e8, which is this idea we saw earlier, but I was thinking specifically if the bishop comes to g5, and my queen's already on d7, I can just step away from knight e8. So I figured, well, I don't particularly need h6. Bishop g5 isn't dangerous because I can just step my knight away. So everything's fine. First of all, I'm not sure how much I really took into account this knight g5 move, because I was sort of fixated on bishop g5 and sort of getting my own plans in. But yeah, also, this whole comment about bishop g5 being met by moving the knight away looks a bit strange once you see my next move, but we'll get to that in a second. After queen d7, my opponent castled, which is a decent move. Knight g5, like I said, is an option available to white, but there's nothing wrong with just castling and getting on with it. And okay, like I mentioned earlier, the sack on h3 doesn't work straight away because, you can probably just play bishop e3 or something. The idea is you're threatening to play queen takes g3, but I think white can answer that with just bishop e3. This doesn't work yet because white's knight sort of has to be on h4 for it to make any sense, because then you have two threats. You have threatening to take on h4 with the queen, and you're threatening to take on g3 with the queen, as well as the idea of playing knight g4, threatening mate on h2, threatening the f2 pawn, and all this. So, okay. My next move was bad. Everything else before, like, in the strict technical sense, the only mistake I've made so far in the game is using too much time. But the next move is genuinely bad. I played rook a d8, with the idea of, well, centralizing the rook, I had this idea in mind of taking on e4 and landing the queen on d3 at some stage to annoy white. But the move is just bad because of bishop g5. And, well, I didn't miss bishop g5. I had a tactical idea in mind that I was going to use in response to bishop g5. But it doesn't work. I miscalculated it. And then actually, after realizing that I miscalculated my original intention, I came up with an alternate idea. And then it turned out that also didn't work. So I had to eventually accept this really bad position where I had double pawns on f6 and f7, and white was landing a knight on f5, and my king was really exposed. But anyways, we'll get to that in a second. Instead of rook a d8, the right plan is probably actually still just to take on e4, and after takes, to take on b3, and play, at some stage, queen e6, or maybe start with h6 first, or play rook f d8, perhaps, or play knight e8. We've transposed at this point back into some strong games here. Like, for example, there's the game Malachov Nair, which continued with queen e6, and from 2007, which is eventually drawn. But yeah, okay, so rook a d8, bishop g5. Now, yeah, one thing that it's important to do after playing a tournament game, for example, well, they say to first of all analyze the game yourself without using an engine first, and that's probably true. Ideally, you would sort of have a postmortem with your opponent after the game. That way, you can sort of analyze you're sort of forced to analyze by yourself without a computer, and you can also sort of get an idea of what your opponent was thinking during the game as well, which can often be quite insightful. Yeah, one thing that's important to do is to some degree write down your thoughts after the game. Like, write down some key variations that you saw during the game, because analyzing with a computer is a lot less meaningful if you don't get to compare the computer's variations with what you saw during the game. Because, yeah, I mean, for example, a computer could suggest some move is strong, and if you're looking at your own game, like let's say 2 weeks after playing it, and you see, oh, the computer says this move is strong, why didn't I play it? Whereas if you'd, written down some variations you calculated during the game, you might see, oh, I thought this was bad because of this move, but then the computer shows a resource that actually refutes the reason why I thought this move was bad. Anyways, bishop g5. So, in the game, I played DE. Well, I played DE. Of course, the important point is the knight can't run away anymore because it's pinned to the rook. And white, if uninterrupted, will most likely play bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and something like knight h4 and either knight hf5 or knight gf5. And that position will be very, very, very good for white, because not only these pawns are potentially weak, the knight is extremely strong on f5, and black's king is quite weak. And yeah, like I said, it's to some extent important to transcribe your thoughts from the game, because you do run the risk. Like, if you look at the game with the computer, let's say some days removed from actually playing the game, you do sort of risk learning the wrong lessons. Like, you could conceivably see this game and pull the lesson that, oh, well, you should realize that this pawn structure is bad for black, and you didn't realize that this pawn structure and the knight being on f5 was so bad for you, and that's why you lost. But actually, rather than being sort of a strategic misunderstanding, it was actually a tactical miscalculation. So my original intention, when I played rook a d8, was to beat bishop g5 with the following: d takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes b3. Now this would be completely fine if white were to play a takes b3, because black gets queen e6 in, covers the f6 knight, and actually, as the Lee Chess database informs me, we've transposed to a game where Sargassian, I don't know how to say that name, from 2006, which white eventually won, but black was probably fine round about this juncture of the game. But white's, of course, going to play bishop takes f6. And, well, okay. Well, okay, the move I was planning looks rather silly when you see it from this position, but keep in mind I was calculating this from this board position. It's still kind of stupid, but it was bishop d1, that I had in mind when I calculated this line. And the idea, of course, is that black's moving the bishop out of attack and attacking the white queen. But obviously, the square d1 is covered 3 times by white, and it's only defended twice by black. And the reason why I thought the bishop was safe on this square is because when I was calculating from this position, rook a d8, bishop g5, d takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes b3, bishop takes f6, bishop d1, I was still imagining the bishop was back on c1, so this rook wasn't actually covering the d1 square, which is of course a rather silly mistake to make, and that's sort of another lesson I think I should glean from this game, is that you need to keep in mind for this sort of retained image thing of a piece still being back where you physically see it on the board. And I do wonder whether looking away from the board more often while calculating could help with this, because if you're staring at the board and trying to calculate this line and you're physically seeing the white bishop on c1, I wonder if that sort of clouds your calculations by imagining that the bishop is still there in the line where it's clearly no longer there. Anyways, so that clearly doesn't work, and I realize that doesn't work. I think I realized this after I played rook a d8. At some point while my opponent was thinking on this move, I realized, oh wait, bishop d1, the bishop's not on c1 anymore, so that score's covered 3 times. So I had to come up with an alternative plan, and I did manage to come up with another idea, which unfortunately does not work. So he played bishop g5, and yeah, so suddenly I have to reevaluate all of my life choices. And the secondary idea that I came up with was d takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes b3, bishop takes f6, and now instead of the ill-advised bishop d1, I had this idea to play queen e6. And the point of queen e6, let me just promote this variation, is that if a takes b3, of course queen takes f6, and black's going to be totally fine, at least relative to what he deserves. And after bishop takes d8, the idea is bishop c4. And so we gave up the rook on d8, but we're skewering the queen and the rook on d1. So we're hoping to win the material back. So I spent quite a long time here, because in my mind, at this point, when I was calculating this, the critical line went queen to c2, bishop takes f1, bishop to h4. Okay, and now black's restored material parity, but he's got to be careful about his bishop because it's very nearly trapped. And it's very important that the bishop go to b5 and not c4, because if you go to c4, I assume it just gets trapped straight away like this. So you have to go to b5. And here, well, this looks incredibly scary. Well, incredibly scary. And the idea is after a4, you go bishop c4. And b3 is not possible because the bishop takes b3. So, I spent a fair amount of time around this point calculating to ensure, and of course I was calculating back from, I think this position was the one I saw on the board when I started calculating, or maybe even it was this one, to make sure in this variation here, this bishop on b5 doesn't get trapped somehow. And after a while, I couldn't find any way for white to trap it. And checking with the computer, I was right. The bishop doesn't get trapped. Because a4 and b3 doesn't work straight away, and if b3, worst case scenario, you just dip with the knight back somewhere and the bishop comes to c6 or d7 or e8 or wherever, and that should be okay. You can try moves like knight 2, but again, this is the same thing probably. Therefore, I thought this was okay for black. So I played d takes e, I played bishop takes b3, and then I think it was after he played bishop takes f6 when I realized why this doesn't work. And this doesn't work because after queen e6, bishop takes d8, bishop c4, white's not forced to move the queen. He's got this move instead, knight g5, which just basically wins the game on the spot. Because after bishop takes e2, for example, you don't have any square for the queen. If you move the queen back, white plays queen takes bishop. And remember, white took a rook here on d8. So at the moment, white is a full rook up. And if, for example, bishop takes e2, knight takes e6, hits the rook on d8. Say bishop takes f1, knight takes f8. Well, the material count isn't particularly going to favor black at the end of this. Therefore, I realized I couldn't play queen e6 because it just doesn't work. And the lesson from this is, I forget who said long variation, wrong variation. Larson maybe, but yeah, when you're calculating a long variation and you're trying at the end of it to work out if the position at the end of it is fine for you or not, you always have to go back and check whether the variation is actually forced. In this case, it is extremely not forced, because chess isn't checkers. You don't have to, respond to everything that your opponent does by giving a direct response to it. So having realized that bishop d1 is not possible and queen e6 doesn't work, I ended up having to go for this move g takes f6. And now the problem is twofold. White plays a takes b3 first of all. The problem is twofold. First of all, the position is really bad. Second of all, I've spent probably the majority of my clock time by this point trying to avoid this exact bad scenario and failing to avoid this exact bad scenario, meaning I've got a bad position and I've wasted a lot of clock time. And those two things put together meant that, I wasn't able to defend this position. And it's bad. It's quite bad because, well, you have to worry about a knight coming to f5, a queen coming to g4, and checkmate being given on g7. That's one thing you have to worry about. And another thing you have to worry about is knight h5 being played and this f6 pawn falling off the board, for example. By the way, actually going back for a sec, there was an alternative. There was some bailout with queen d3, like something like this, that was possible. But eventually I decided I actually wanted to brave my chances in the middle game because there was this line I calculated that went queen d3, rook d3. And now it was something like bishop f6, gf6, knight h5, and then I think it was takes, rook d6, defending the pawn for the time being, but white's got another knight to bring in. And again, this f5 square becomes a rather large problem. I think black kind of has to, because if you allow knight e5, knight f5, if the rook goes back, you hang your f6 pawn in addition to all the other problems with your position. And if you go to e6, well, that's not very good, for one thing. And for another thing, there's probably just something strong happening immediately. But knight e7, and now, for example, rook to the d file. And the idea is, if you trade rooks, or let the rooks be traded on d6, the f6 pawn is just indefensible now. And the issue is if you play rook f d8, then this f6 pawn hangs because the rook is pinned to the other rook behind it. Now this variation I actually did manage to calculate. The computer suggests, in some position, black's better off. I think it's here. You're better off just ditching the f-pawn like this. And it says it's bad for black, because of course it's bad for black, but it says only like +1 compared to the game continuation, or white's just quite winning. So I don't know. It seemed like I had, better chances in the... If I'm just... This ending, I'm just dropping a pawn by force. I might have better chances in the middle game. But I really don't have better chances in the middle game, because black's got absolutely no counterplay. And he's just very close to getting mated in a lot of lines. So anyways, returning to the game, after a takes b3 here, I thought maybe on a very good day I'd be able to generate some sort of counterplay with king h8, rook g8, rook g6, the other rook coming over. And somehow this bishop, with its counterpart no longer on the board, would finally be able to participate in a kingside attack. Of course, that's not actually going to happen, but I thought, optimistically, if my opponent messes up, there could be counter chances, whereas in the ending, I'm just a pawn down and suffering. It's bad either way. I'm not sure whether... Yeah. probably it's a better choice to go for the endgame. At very least objectively, but probably practically as well, to be honest, because this is just quite bad. But anyways, let's see how it continued. So I played king h8. Again, yeah, I mentioned this idea of putting the rook on the g-file. Really objectively just makes the situation worse, but queen d3 might again be the best shot for black, but this transposes to the line that I mentioned earlier, where after queen d3, rook d3, knight h5, white wins a pawn. But again, that might be the best chance. King h8, rook a1, queen e6, b4. Yeah, b4 is an annoying move, just safeguarding the pawn on b3, and, well, the other problem is, now it makes this bishop on a7 look rather silly, because it's really, white's king is in no danger, so it's doing nothing on this diagonal, really. Like, you can make a cheap threat at some point with rook g8 threatening to take on g3, but aside from that, it doesn't do much. So, black would sort of like to transfer it back over to e7 or even to f8, perhaps, or d6 or something. But now that path is blocked off. So that's quite annoying. And you get this sort of scenario where there's no counterplay, the position's bad, and while you're annoyed you're in this bad position, and also you've got very little time to come up with some sort of way to get counterplay or rearrange your pieces in a sensible way. So yeah, rook takes d1, that's not a good move, but and then rook g8. I forget what my reasoning was for this. I think after rook g8, I thought he might just take on d8 or something, and then either divert my rook away from the g-file or force my knight to go back. I'm not sure. But then again, the knight coming back to d8, to be honest, d8 might be a more useful square for the knight than c6, because at least it might be able to resurface on e6 at some stage. So this move doesn't make much sense. Rook g8 and just knight f5. And I made some sort of an attempt at counterplay. Knight f5, by the way, is not even the only move, but it looks like a decent one to me. I played a5 with the idea that should he push b5, I might at least be able to swing my knight around somewhere here, or go to d8 and hope to reemerge on e6 or something. But really, it's not good. Just b takes a5, knight takes a5. I mean, you could hope to put your knight on some square here, but yeah, I mean, even then it doesn't do a whole lot. Knight 3h4 he plays, knight c6. Again, getting rid of this pawn, I'm hoping to maybe get my bishop back into play, but he of course just plays b4. b4 is a nice move, just keeping the pieces on the queen side under lock and key, and yeah, really long term it's hard to fashion a defense for black. I played knight b8, which is a silly move, but yeah, I was playing off the increment around this point, and without a clear plan, I was just flailing, basically. I think I had also just missed white's upcoming winning idea. He just goes knight h6, and, yeah. Well, the problem is if the rook leaves the back rank, rook d8 is going to be mate, so I rook f8, but now knight 4 f5, and there's not really a defense to queen g4 with mate coming up on g7, and yeah, really none of these pieces are particularly participating in the defense, and these knights are just so dominant. I played queen b6, queen g4 takes on f2. If king h2, then queen f4 check, but just king h1, of course, and I resigned here because there's no defense. Yeah, I didn't really investigate the latter part of this game in much detail. Maybe around this point, yeah, this is what I'm saying about, I don't really remember much of what I was thinking around this point, so it might have been useful to transcribe some thoughts about some of the alternatives that black may have played here. But again, in time trouble, I'm not sure how many coherent thoughts I had anyways. And besides, the position was already rather bad. But yeah, there's always this problem of after d4, these pieces can't really get into the defense. You can try to transfer the knight to a square like e6 or even eventually f4, but in reality, you just won't be in time for any of this. And the back rank is always reasonably weak as well, which is a problem. And actually, yeah, one thing I remember saying after the game, the problem sort of is twofold in that white's got a very strong attack on the king side, and even if you manage to avoid getting mated on the king side, there's always this plan of playing queen d3 and queen d7, and just trying to swap off queens and just win the ending, where you might get a rook to the 7th rank, and the pawns are quite weak, especially the f6 pawn. And I hadn't seen this idea of putting the knight here, and going queen g4 and mate. I think that kind of explains his knight b8 move to an extent. I was still sort of worried that he might just try to swap queens and easily win the ending. But of course, white just has this plan of giving mate. So anyways, some key things that I think I learned from that game is not to bother spending so much time in the opening, weighing, bishop e6, bishop g5 versus h6, g4, because realistically both of those are fine for black. Like, white's got some chances to attack, but realistically they should both be okay for black. And actually it turns out that white was probably just intending to play knight g3 against both of them anyway, so it's kind of a waste. And same with, I learned to be careful about delaying this h6 move. h6 can become a hook in some lines, but you shouldn't really allow knight g5 or bishop g5 for so long, because eventually it's likely to be a good move. Theoretically, just like concretely opening theory-wise, I learned that the right move here is to probably just take on e4, take, and then play knight e8, knight d6, which is a maneuver I'm not sure I was aware of. Or if you're not going to do that, just play h6 and rook e8 and queen d7, rook a d1 or something. So yeah, that's sort of about the opening. And then calculation, I guess I'm more aware than I am previously of this sort of retained image thing that happened with the bishop on c1 and my bishop going to d1 and the rook not defending that square. Now I've got a game to connect to that retained image idea and keep it in mind in the future. And also this whole long variation, wrong variation concept, where I spent all this time calculating the long line 5-6 moves deep, only to miss this knight g5 shot near the beginning of the line. And, I was sort of aware of it before, but I'm more acutely aware of it now. Knights on f5 are extremely strong. Don't allow this to happen. And I also learned time management lessons from earlier on in the game, where I used a lot of time in the first 15-16 moves only to get a bad position anyways, and then collapse. Like I said, this is a bad position, but rook takes d1 was a bad move, a5 was a bad move, and knight b8 was a bad move. And they're all, I guess, opportunities to put up more resistance, if not necessarily, get a good position. Okay, so that's all I have for now. And yeah, see ya.